Right, good afternoon. If you are in my side of the world, hello from Dubai. We have a lot of good mornings as well. If you're stateside, wherever you're from, welcome. I'm just waiting as the participant list is now increasing in numbers, and we're just letting people onto the platform, and we'll start in just a few seconds. I think we're looking good. Really good to see a very big turnout with us today. All right, there we go. All right, welcome everyone. Really good to be with you. My name is Eleni Jokas. I'm an anchor and correspondent at CNN here in Dubai. I will be your moderator and your host for the day. I'd like to welcome you all to the Middle East and Central Asia Regional Economic Outlook webinar hosted by the Dubai International Finance Center. We'll be discussing divergent recoveries in turbulent times in the Middle East and North Africa. That is our theme for today. I'd like to welcome our incredible panelists and guests, Mr. Jihad Azur, Director of Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF, Ms. Alia Mubayed Mina, and Pakistan Chief Economist at Jefferies, Mr. Arif Hussain, Chief Economist at the United Nations World Food Programme, Mr. Marwan Muasher, Vice President for Studies at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Mr. Nasser Saidi, the founder and president of Nasser Saidi and Associates. All right, just a few housekeeping rules. We are going to be taking questions from you throughout the session. Please send your questions into our chat box. I'm going to be keeping a close watch on your comments and your questions, and hopefully we'll try to get through to them as much as possible. We also have translation for you into Arabic, so please keep a lookout for that. You'll be able to just click on the interpretation key on your screen so that you can listen in Arabic. All right, so we also have a Twitter handle. We'd love for you to use this, hashtag IMF MENA, hashtag IMF MENA. And of course, we are going to be taking questions throughout the day. All right, so I'd like to now welcome Mrs. Alia Hussain Al-Zaruni, Executive Vice President of Operations at the DIFC, for her opening remarks. Alia, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good evening. So on behalf of Dubai International Financial Center, I would like to welcome you all to today's IMF Regional Economic Outlook. DIFC is a long-standing partner of the IMF, and the Outlook reports always offer valuable insights. They help shape the thinking of decision makers within the finance industry and those that contribute to the economic growth within the Emirates and the UAE as a whole. I'm looking forward to hearing Jihad Azur, Director to IMF's Middle East and Central Asia Department, take us through the report in detail and share his insights. I've read the report myself, and I have to say, even though these are turbulent times, I feel optimistic for Dubai. Although Dubai has one of the most diversified economies, the increase in oil prices will definitely send positive sentiments within oil exporting countries like the UAE. Increased oil prices are often met with, although carefully considered, higher levels of spending. And with such higher levels of spending, we expect higher support or more support from the financial industry, ranging from project finance to trade finance to commodity trading. And I have to say that DIFC clients, which make up the largest financial center in this region, are best placed to make the best and the most of the opportunities that present themselves. Dubai is regarded as the region's preferred and the most stable business destination, which also supports sustainable economic growth. The report highlights that accelerating structural reforms has become even more important for certain parts of this region, and we agree to that. Our strategy 2030 reflects on, or has a focus on, increasing revenue generating capacity from the finance sector to help the country achieve its development goals. If you take an example, for example, our focus on fintech and innovation, which has attracted more than 500 firms to the DIFC, and that accounts to more than 60% of firms within the sector in the MENA region itself. They will definitely contribute to the future growth of the finance sector, which already boasts highest GDP contribution per person compared to other industries. Since our inception 18 years ago, the DIFC Authority, our center independent bodies, the DFSA and DIFC courts, We have all become role models for governance and nurturing high levels of productivity in the world of finance. Environment, social, and governance principles are top of mind for the DIFC entities. And I have to say that over 80% of the entities in the DIFC consider these in their business decision-making. DIFC is co-leading an ESG working group across the finance industry and to ensure Dubai is the region's most sustainable financial city. And more broadly, Hawkama, which is a subsidiary to the DIFC for over a decade, has been helping businesses improve their governance in line with global best practice. We have the most agreements in place with other like-minded entities in the region and further afield, which allows us to share experience and boost or best practice, which would help deliver sustainable economic growth. Thank you again to the IMF for partnering with us on this important event, and I will hand over to Jihad now. Thanks.
Alia, thank you so very much. It was really great to hear you give us sort of an overview of what we've been experiencing in this region, and really fascinating. We're going to head straight into the conversation now, and it would be fantastic for us to just get through some of these key themes as we start off. We know that the war and the conflict in Ukraine has created an enormous amount of contagion effect, whether it's got to do with wheat prices or oil prices or the incredible uncertainty that we've seen emerge. It is an absolute crisis point for so many low-income countries and middle-income countries, specifically in the MENA region. The ripple effect has been enormous. We also know that inequalities have been accentuated not only by the pandemic, which we were hoping we were moving out from, but also right now with this new set of uncertainties that have hit so many global markets. We've also seen the impact of China's new lockdowns, what that's done to supply chains, and of course, what that means in terms of true recovery going forward. I'd like to repeat our theme today: divergent recoveries in turbulent times. And this exactly is what it needs to be focused on. How do we move out of this new stark reality that perhaps we weren't ready for? Our first theme for today is going to be mounting headwinds faced by the region. And Jihad, this is where I'd like for you to weigh in. And we've spoken a little bit about, and I think over the past few weeks, since the release of the economic outlook for the MENA region, just what that means. And I tell you, when I looked at the forecast, it is absolutely scary in some sections of the report where your forecasts are really pointing to a dire inflationary environment and major shocks that are still to come. Could you give me an overview of the key findings of the report?
Thank you very much, Eleni, and thank you to Alia. We are always proud with the partnership we have with the IFC. Eleni, you said it all. I think this year's outlook, it's a story of disruption and divergence. The region was recovering gradually after the aftermath of the COVID-19, and the growth has surprised on the upside in 2021, 5.8%. And then the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia have disrupted this recovery, that though countries were enjoying a better performance in 2021, though a certain number of clouds were always affecting those. Inflation was the most challenging one, but also the scars from the crisis, as well as also the deep-seated issues that the region is facing. Disruption, the war in Ukraine, and the sanctions have direct impact on some of MENA countries through the impact on supply of basic commodities and goods, especially for countries who are dependent on import from Russia and Ukraine for wheat, for oil, for gas, but also indirect, or I would say the global impact, the increase in prices, as we saw it, that became a challenging issue for the whole economy. Also the disruption in the supply chain, the tension we saw in the financial markets. Those two forces are going to shape up the outlook for this year. And this is a story of divergence, because if we compare to the past, countries used to evolve more or less in the same, I would say, direction. While this year we are going to see, I would say, three groups. The first group is the oil exporting countries who are going to benefit from the increase in oil price. Their outlook will improve in 2022 because of the windfall coming from increase in price, but also increase of volume of oil production. Those countries will enjoy and will lead growth in 2022. And I would say also, to be here comprehensive, that even in 2021, their recovery was stronger than the other because they took the right measures in terms of the way to fight COVID and also to accelerate the transformation of the non-oil sector. But 2022 is a different story. We expect oil price compared to last year to increase by 55%, which will improve their growth prospect, but also it will be a big windfall in terms of capital flows. If we look at the next 4 to 5 years, to give a order of magnitude, we're expecting more than $1 trillion to $1.4 trillion of additional revenues to oil exporting countries, especially to the GCC. They will also benefit from the fact that inflation is still very low, especially headline inflation. And therefore, they're not suffering like other countries by the increase in basic food and commodity prices. They have their issues and their challenges in terms of policies, and I'll come back to that in a minute. The second group is the middle-income countries, the EMs, the emerging markets of the region. Those are affected by the multitude of shocks. The increase in prices, inflation is a challenging issue for them, especially most of them have a fixed exchange rate. Especially the increase in prices in basic commodities and in oil affect also their fiscal, because they still, for some of them, have a generous subsidy system, and therefore the increase in prices may not reflect totally in terms of inflation, but it is weakening already a challenged situation in public finance, especially for countries with high level of debt. And three, for those countries, the pressure we're seeing in the international financial markets, for many of them who are active, a borrower in the international financial markets, is affecting their macroeconomic stability. And we should not forget the third group, the group of fragile states, low-income countries that face huge effect of COVID crisis because they have limited capacity to vaccinate, weak medical infrastructure. Those are going to also be very much in a dire situation because their capacity to store food and their resources are limited, and therefore they are going to face a major impact because of the war in Ukraine and the sanctions. What are the issues to focus on this year? You said it, Elaine, in the beginning, inflation is first, especially that inflation has reached 14.8% last year. And the trends are showing that inflation is to stay with us for some time. It requires to adjust policies. Inflation is also an issue that has a social implication because headline inflation is dominating in the region, where 60% of increase in prices is coming from basic commodities, mainly food. This has huge social impact. The second important issue to watch is oil price, that is positively affecting oil exporters, but also having an impact on oil importing countries. Three, geopolitical tension and the risks that we are seeing growing, the risk of fragmentation, especially that the region is affected by both geopolitical movements and also because of its integration, especially in terms of trade with China and East, it will be affected by risks of fragmentation. China, you mentioned it, Eleni. Slowdown in China will have an impact on the region. In addition to that, there are a certain number of other important factors to weigh in. Social stability. It's very important to keep watching the social situation, especially in countries where prices went up. Therefore, all those factors need to be watched, and they're showing that the level of headwinds is growing. What does it mean in terms of policies? And maybe I can elaborate on that further. But I think this year is going to be a year of policies whereby fighting inflation is key, making sure that fiscal consolidation over time is achieved in a medium term. yet taking into consideration addressing the impact of any consolidation on low-income groups. And last but not the least is the way to manage those policies is going to be important for investors, for internal stability, but also for the medium term.
Jihad, thank you so much. I mean, to be honest, it's so sobering hearing, your analysis, a year of policies. And it's interesting because we've just come through years of pain. We were hoping for years of growth, and now we have to look at policies. Marwan, I want to bring you into this conversation, and we're talking about a confluence of factors here, right? Which could be quite consequential to, the poorest of the poor countries, and even countries that are sort of teetering on the edge. So many countries did not have extra buffers to be able to deal with such a huge shock after the pandemic. What is the potential fallout of all these factors, rising food prices and rising oil prices, and what is that going to mean for social stability in your mind?
Well, as Jihad said, if we were talking about the situation last year, we would have been covered. This year, we're talking about the Ukraine crisis. What is becoming clear is that crises in the Arab world, maybe in the whole world, are becoming the norm if they ever were not. And that means that we can no longer just satisfy ourselves with ad hoc reforms. Structural reforms need to be accelerated, particularly for oil importing countries in the region, which are today facing a double impact, rising oil prices as well as rising food prices. In oil exporting countries, the rise in food prices is offset by the rise in oil prices. The other problem we're facing in the region is that in the past, when crises like these happen, oil importing countries to a large extent could depend on oil exporting countries, whether in the form of grants or remittances or what have you. Today, that is no longer a given in the region. Today, grants are being made largely for political reasons, not just for economic reasons. Egypt has received more than $5 billion today from Saudi Arabia to offset the rise in food prices because of the Ukraine. But the ability of the Saudis to keep giving this kind of money, particularly if we witness a long, Ukrainian crisis, is not indefinite. And for oil importing countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, like Egypt and others, I'm afraid that this is going to mean maybe some social unrest. The situation cannot go on for a long time without social unrest. And it speaks to the need, as I said, for accelerated structural reforms, which the report talked about. But these reforms are not just, in my view, in the fiscal sphere. The Arab world needs a new educational system, needs to lay the ground for long-term reform and not just to address, crises which seem to appear every year. We need a different educational system to prepare people not just to deal with the labor force, but to deal with life in general. My other fear, Elaine, if I may, is that a lot of oil-producing countries started doing the right thing after the decline in oil prices in 2014 and did a number of needed economic reforms in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, and elsewhere. My fear is that rising oil prices, if they stay up for a while, might entice these countries to go back to business as usual. Because as much as oil has really been beneficial to the region, it has also been a curse in terms of obstructing both economic and political reform. And if oil prices remain high for a while, I hope that these countries won't go back to business as usual and understand that in the long term, structural reforms are a must.
Okay, thank you so much, Marwan, for that contribution. Nasser, welcome. Really great to have you on. We've spoken a few times on air. My question to you is, in terms of the risk of a potential global recession and specifically a stagflationary environment, we heard Marwan as well as Jihad refer to this. You know, we're really worried about where we're going at this point in time with the inflationary outlook. You're seeing central banks trying to tighten. And of course, that means less cheap money into the system. We know what happens when the US starts to tighten. This is pretty unprecedented. That means you're not going to have cheap money flowing into emerging markets. You're going to have money flowing out. What is your sort of outlook and prognosis based on sort of the realities that Jihad and Marwan have tabled for us?
Yeah, I just want to build a little bit on both Jihad and Marwan. So we've got a number of external shocks hitting the region, right? Higher food prices, higher energy prices, stagflation, but also importantly, the tightening that you mentioned from central banks and higher rates. So the countries pegged to the US dollar have had to follow suit, and given no monetary independence, they're having to raise interest rates. And others as well. We've seen Algeria, Iran, and others also see their currencies depreciate, and Egypt depreciate as well. So the external shocks are also translating into internal shocks. And I think one of the worrying aspects that I want to add to the discussion is the high level of indebtedness of some of the countries of the region, in particular Egypt, right? Where you've got a large amount of foreign currency debt. Debt to GDP is around 90% in Egypt. So whenever you have this rise in interest rates, you're going to have a rise in risk premium. And that's going to affect flows into the region, as you mentioned, and indeed, you're going to have capital outflows. So I think that added to all of this is a difficult policy environment, which Jihad pointed to. And it's a very divergent policy environment between the oil importers and food importers and the oil exporters on the other side. So I think as we move forward, the main thing that I worry about is that you've got many factors which are outside the control of the region. You've got central bank policies, and looks like central banks, whether it's the Fed or the ECB or other major central banks, are going to continue monetary tightening. You know? You've got a large unknown in terms of what's going to be happening in China and its impact. If China continues with a lockdown policy and there isn't any change. And at the same time, you've got the continuation of a Russian war on Ukraine. You have the possibility not just of stagflation, but of a simultaneous or synchronous global recession. And if that happens, then you're going to have a deep impact on trade and tourism into the region, yeah, particularly for the Mediterranean countries. Maybe our forecasts for oil prices are not going to be as good as we thought they were going to be. This will have an impact on the oil market. So we might not see the high oil prices that we've seen before if we enter into a recessionary outlook. And it looks, by my taking, if I look at purchasing managers' incentives and indicators, Europe might go into a recession before the rest, given the ongoing conflict.
Pardon my interjection, but I have to ask you this while you're continuing, and I want you to continue on your thought process. Right. Is this avoidable? Because I'm thinking we don't have all the resources that we had pre-pandemic, where we just throw money at the problem and we just that's what we do. We stimulate. We've seen the results of that. Inflation. We didn't think it was going to happen, right? The naysayers were saying that from 2008, it's now come. We've got inflation. Right.
But I think the Fed took the punch bowl too late off the table, right? Yeah. They should have done it much earlier. So now we have to live with this inflation, and it's not going to disappear very quickly. But in addition to the inflation and core inflation, we've also got this terms of trade shock, which has very different implications for the different countries of the region. So the question is, how do you act towards that? And I think there's precious little that you can do on the monetary policy side for many of the countries of the region. So you're going to have to think about social protection. I think that's very much on the agenda. You're going to have to think about structural reforms, as Marwan was pointing out. But I think also, above all, I'll come back to that theme maybe later on. I'd like to see much more regional solidarity, by which I mean this is the time for the IMF to get together with the Arab Monetary Fund and to the GCC countries to put in place food and energy financing facilities, to tide this over. Many of the countries are going to face balance of payments problems. They're already facing food problems. So maybe this is the time where we need to think about putting together these facilities to help tide over these issues. And the GCC countries and other oil exporters have substantial financial resources, as Jihad was pointing out. So this is the time at which we need to put together these regional financial financing possibilities.
Thank you so much, Nasser. Alia, I'd like for you to come in here as well. Commodity prices are spiking. In fact, there's a fear that we'll probably see a similar shock to what we saw in the early 70s. The only thing encouraging about that is that there was, a better life after that huge shock. But how are you guys looking at how the region is going to be affected through the commodity price cycle that we're seeing right now? And what opportunities would you say are there for oil exporting countries as well as importing countries right now?
Sure, thank you, Eleni, and thank you again for involving me in such an important discussion. I mean, sitting in the market, obviously, we are trying to scrutinize in order to better understand the impact of these higher commodity prices and tightening global financial condition on the region's economy. And as a previous speaker had mentioned, indeed, they are very divergent, but the channels are essentially on the first, at the first level are through the trade channel and the financing channel. The trade channel through a higher commodity and commodities prices in oil and food. This is a region which has some of the largest wheat importers of the world: Egypt, Iraq, Morocco. And many of the countries are most dependent on Ukraine and Russia, with countries like Lebanon and Tunisia sometimes reaching 90 to 95% of their wheat imports coming from these countries. So the trade channel shock is quite significant. And obviously, the financing channel is significant because, particularly for oil importers, and we are seeing their current account deficit widen considerably. I mean, looking at the the IMF's forecast, I mean, from pre-pandemic level, we're looking at a doubling of current account deficit of oil importers from 35 billion to almost 70 billion. And if you add on top of that the refinancing needs of a lot of these oil importers, so we are looking at external funding needs for MENA oil importers and Pakistan of around close to $100 billion in a context of much higher interest rates. So both these channels have been quite detrimental to oil importers. Having said that, of course, they provide opportunities for oil exporters, right? I mean, the oil exporting countries are getting one of the most positive terms of trade shock in recent history. That is allowing them to replenish the buffers that they have significantly used during the COVID period, and also recalibrate some of the fiscal policies and support that they have been providing to the economy by taking out some of the monetary policy support and replacing it with other form of possibly investments that now that the fiscal space has allowed it. So there are clear opportunities for oil exporters. The risk, however, of course, for these oil exporters is the temptation, as Dr. Mashar said, to reverse the course of the fiscal reforms that are still necessary to tame the non-hydrocarbon fiscal deficit that is necessary for long-term fiscal sustainability. That's a clear risk in a long-term path of oil prices that is perceived to be on the downside. But again, I think the major risks lie at the level of oil importers. That's sustainability risks, inflation risks, that are eventually conducive to such a political risk. And we are seeing that, Eleni. I mean, we are seeing this in countries that already defaulted, like Lebanon, and that have, and in the absence of any policy reform, the tension on the political front is making any policy path even more difficult, including an IMF program, unfortunately. But also the debt sustainability pressures are being repriced and maybe pushing many of these countries, preventing them to access financial markets. Where we sit, I mean, with the widening of spreads in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Pakistan, is making many of these countries increase a path to access financial markets almost impossible, if not more difficult. And that will eventually eat into their fiscal space and therefore maximize the kind of domestic shock implication and spillover that Dr. Saidi has spoken about.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really fascinating. I'm going to delve into those two scenarios in just a bit. We've got some questions that have started to come through. I do encourage you to add them to the chat box. I will be getting to those in just a short while, but I want to go to Arif first. Arif, I have to say, you know, we've been covering the food insecurity situation that's currently been going on in Afghanistan. It's really scary to see those images. And then we're seeing what's happening in other low-income countries and countries currently in turmoil. I want you to give me a sense of what was the food insecurity situation like before the Ukrainian crisis, and what are we dealing with today? Because we know that so much grain has been taken out of the market and Ukraine is such a huge supplier to the WFP.
Yeah, thanks, Elena. I think that's an excellent question. Hello, everybody. Let me just go one step even further back, and that's the big COVID. And before COVID, in the world, in the 80 countries where we are present around the world, there were about 135 million people who were in hunger crises or worse situation. That number, because of COVID, doubled and went up as high as 276 million people, right? Around the world, in the same 80 countries where we are present. And of that 276 million people, there were about 43, 44 million people who were in what we call hunger emergencies, like literally one step away from famine. And in not one country or two countries, in about 43 countries. So this was the state of affairs before the war in Ukraine. What war in Ukraine has done, according to our projections, is that it has added an additional 47 million people to already those who were in hunger crises, bringing the total to about 323 million people. This is unprecedented. And by the way, I'm talking about acute hunger. I'm not talking about chronic hunger, which is completely different. And those numbers are staggering at about 811 million people in the world. Now,
could you give me a sense of what the number is in the region? Do we have a handle on what it's like in the region specifically?
In this region, in MENA region, we have about 42. We had about 42 million people who were in hunger crisis or worse. I mean, think of countries like Yemen, Syria, you know, even Lebanon, you know, with things out in OPT and other places. And with this, then with the war in Ukraine, it adds another 15% to that number. Okay, and you know, Linda, one thing which is really worthy of noting is that it is two things. What we see is that the depth of hunger is increasing, meaning people who were hungry, let's say, for like 3 months in a year, now more. And then it is the breadth of hunger. And the last thing I want to say on this question is that the war in Ukraine is not happening in a vacuum. You know, even before this war, we had food prices at a 10-year high. We had fuel prices at a 7-year high. We had record inflation in 36 economies. We had rising debt rates. And then comes this war. And that is what is essentially breaking the camel's back, as they say.
You know, I don't even know what to say. This is, you know, when I thought with the numbers we had earlier were sobering, I think these numbers are harrowing and absolutely hair-raising. And I guess what do we do about this? Jihad, I'm hoping you have some kind of solution in terms of policies that can be implemented to alleviate some of this pressure. I don't really know what to say, but I wonder if you guys have been thinking about this. I know you have at the IMF, but with this new scenario, it's just it's a big game changer, isn't it?
Can I put it in a phrase? How do we avoid the Sri Lankan syndrome? I think is a good way to put it. Look at what happened to Sri Lanka. Exactly. We could have many Sri Lankans across our region. Yeah, starting with Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, you name it.
Well said.
Jihad?
Well, Eleni, I think your question is, I will split it into two parts. I think we need to address the immediate issues, and this is where policy trade-off is going to be important. But also we need to make sure that this erosion that came because of COVID, and it's coming now because of the war in Ukraine, will not get entrenched and will weaken structurally the situation. And this brings me to what Marwan said in the beginning. Immediately, you need to bring inflation down, okay? And the first thing is to look at how inflation is composed in the region. Majority of inflation is headline inflation, driven by food and commodity prices. I think it's very important to keep it under control, not only to preserve macroeconomic stability, but also to address social issues. This is a corollary with another important dimension, is to redirect fiscal to provide the right social safety net. It's very important that we reduce the impact of increasing commodity prices on low-income groups. How is by directing subsidy toward those who need it, and by splitting between subsidy on food and subsidy on gasoline or subsidy on energy. Those are two different issues, and I would say they need to be treated differently. Three is, in terms of food security, this is an important issue. It's not only about availability, but also affordability. And here, I think Arif mentioned it. It's very important to make sure that we have access to food, but also we can provide food to those who need it. In terms of overall impact on current account, because of the increase in food prices, it's $10 billion, which I would say it's manageable as an impact on the balance of payment. But when you go deeper and you assess country by country subgroup, this is where the issue is. And this is where I think policies are going to be extremely important. This is what I said in the beginning. We should avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, acting too little too late, not recognizing that government need to play an important role, and the role has to be very clearly articulated, explaining where the issues are, where the priorities are, and start where the needs are bigger. Therefore, you have the set of policies that you need for the short-term stabilization. But this cannot, give you a full assurance that the situation will recover fast. What you need to do further than that is, and I fully agree, I think there are a certain number of core reforms that are needed, but you need here to have objectives. The first objective is job creation. One of the impact of the COVID crisis is the increase in number of unemployment, especially at the youth level. It increased by 1 to 1.8% in the region over the last 2 years. This has to be a major priority. It has to structure the way we look at running the economy. Creating jobs is something that the private sector is better than the government to do, and the government has an important role to play, which is the role of enabler. Regional support, I think we need to move into more regional partnership, whereby I'm sure there are opportunities here that are immense to use the silver linings that we saw during the COVID crisis, technology, climate transformation. Those are important elements. They require more than one country to chip in. They require investments at a regional scale. Of course, the debt overhang is a real issue for countries who have made effort, but the tides were bigger than what they thought. And when they had, I would say, calm waters, they did not accelerate reforms. It tells you that the reform is a journey. It's not it's a temporary thing. And therefore, maintain the priority of bringing debt down, developing certain number of new policy instruments, modernizing monetary policy, something that many countries need in order to address inflation, improving the quality of statistics. If you want to do targeting today, you need to have good statistics, you need to have good surveys. Therefore, all these elements are needed. You would say, we're in the middle of a war, how we need to think about that. This is the right time to think about these issues. And when it comes to the role of institutions like us, we have been helping. In the last 2 years, we provided more than $65 billion, $20 billion in terms of rapid financing and financing to help countries deal with COVID crisis. And last year, we provided $45 billion in terms of SDRs allocations that provided the liquidity that some countries needed. And Alia alluded to the fact that capital flows are less generous to the region. Going forward, we still are ready to help in accelerating reforms. I think what we need today is a reform-led transformation because the nature of the shock is different from the COVID shock. What we need today is transformation. And this is something that through the RST, through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, we could help. But again, I think like-minded need to work together. We as international organization, we need, and I fully agree with Nasser, to work with regional organizations more. And there is a role also of other stakeholders. Private sector is an important player here that needs to be brought in. And also, I think events like this one, where we bring policymakers, people who are working in agencies like the UN agencies, all these actors need to work together.
Jihad, we have a few questions, and we've got a lot of questions coming through, and they really just center around the likes of inflation. Lebanon's coming up quite a bit, so too is Egypt. Jihad, I'm going to pose this question to you on the inflation outlook specifically, with a continued rise in oil prices and the rise in interest rates as well. What are the expectations on inflation in the MENA countries in the near future? And that is from Adel Al-Kawari from the Qatar Central Bank.
Well, again, I think the nature of inflation is still mainly driven by food and commodity prices in the region, especially for the oil importing ones. Inflation reached 14.9% in 2021. And signs that for the first quarter are showing that pressure on prices is still there. The uncertainty here is the issue of supply and the impact of an extended war in Ukraine and extended level of sanctions on the price of those basic commodities. Oil market, I think what we learned from the oil market over the last 2 years is markets are unpredictable. 2 years ago, we saw prices at low 20. Now we see them at 100 and 100 plus. Still, expectations that oil price will remain relatively high on average, a little higher than $100 the barrel. I think what is important, getting more important now are two things. One, how the market are going to react to the tightening of the monetary policy. And expectations, inflation expectations are key in defining where prices will go. And second is the outlook in terms of how the Chinese economy will do this year. Therefore, inflation pressure is still on the high. It's still mainly driven by headline inflation, except maybe for GCC countries, where it's more core inflation, but it's still under control relatively to what we are seeing in other parts of the world. And again, I think it's very important here that credibility of policy to be strengthened in order to help central banks deal with this phenomenon.
Thank you so much, Jihad. As I said, we've got so many questions coming through. I'm going to try and spread them out. Arif, I want you to handle this one. This is from Kambiz Tavana from VOA. The question about the impact of Ukraine on Iran specifically and the region, which we already see is happening. If the crisis continues and goes on further, what are we to expect? Could you give me a sense of it from a food security perspective?
Yeah, so basically what you're seeing is that, again, I mean, you know, what I was saying earlier, that these things are not happening in a vacuum. So when you look at Iran and other countries for that matter, I mean, you're looking at food inflation of about 44%. So anything in that type of environment when is not going to be good for the masses. This is just simple common sense, and this is what we are observing. I mean, there are like 4 or 5 million people who are severely undernourished in Iran to begin with, and then when we are looking at our predictions and estimates, we see that the numbers are going to rise significantly. All I can tell you is that the sooner we can sort out the Ukraine war issue, the sooner we can open up the Black Sea for trade to not only flow, but trade to flow at reasonable costs, the sooner these problems will be somewhat resolved. And back to the fact that, you know, the world wasn't in the best place even before this crisis, right? So for us, when we are looking at countries one by one, we are present in Iran. Mostly, we are not assisting everybody there, but we are assisting Afghan refugees who are in Iran. You know, we are looking at all of these things, and again, our hope, our appeal to the rest of the world is to make sure that the trade starts to move, because when that happens, some of these problems will automatically go away. Not all of them, but some of them will.
Nasser, we have a few questions on Lebanon, and I'm just trying to filter them through. There really are quite a few coming through on whether Lebanese authorities, you believe, can implement all of the reforms requested by the IMF. No block of powers seems to have a majority right now. Do you believe this can lead to more polarization, or can this factor play a role in accelerating reforms which are preconditions for a loan? This is from Magali Aboud, a journalist from L'Orient Leisure on Lebanon. And of course, Nasser, being a former politician, I'd love to get your view on this before we give this question to Jihad.
Okay, I think what's important is that the IMF and the IMF teams that visited Lebanon over the past 2.5 years pointed out what are the nature of reforms that are required. So if you look at the staff level agreement and the discussions around that, there were a set of preconditions given, and then there was the outline, or there is the outline of a program, both for stabilization and recovery. If you look at the nature of the reforms involved, they are also structural in nature. You have to restructure the banking and financial sector. You have to restructure the debt. You have to look at issues such as social protection, given the large increase in the degree of poverty. UN points to about 80% of the Lebanese now poor. What was a middle income country has been reduced to a third world or even fourth world country in the short space of 2 years. So I think what's important, and to the IMF's credit, is that they pointed out what these reforms are. Fiscal adjustment, debt sustainability, all of those issues had been brought up before. Now, they were not dealt with by Lebanese politicians or by Lebanese government or the central bank. The main issue, and you're right to ask the question, and the question is on spot, do we have now change in the political landscape that would make us hopeful that you would see some of these reforms being implemented? One is relatively optimistic in that you have some 13, 14 young, new voices, independent politicians coming into parliament. The main question is, does that change the nature of decision-making, both at the level of parliament, which remains strongly fragmented? Will it lead to what is required? Whenever you have a reform program, such as being proposed, you need a strong government and you need national consensus. And you need a discussion of this program. For example, the SLA with the IMF wasn't even put up for public discussion. If you look at other cases, Greece, Cyprus, etc., where you have reforms, these reforms were put up for public discussion. Here, all of this was dealt in a dark room, and then you suddenly get an agreement coming up. This has to change. So transparency, disclosure, accountability, better governance, anti-corruption are all critical moving forward. So if I want to summarize, there is some optimism in that there is some change in the political landscape. Do I believe that the political will to implement deep and what could be unpopular reforms is there? No, I don't see that. And I want to point to a danger, and we've seen this in other countries, that the politicians will try to use the scarecrow or the IMF to say it is the IMF's fault instead of their fault, which is where they led our country to. And I think it's extremely important for accountability, both for Lebanon, but also in the region, that the politicians and policymakers who deliberately put Lebanon into the deepest crisis and recession that we know in world history, right? Multiple crises, currency, debt, banking, economic, you name it, be held accountable. Because if they are not, then it's highly unlikely that you will have reforms, and it'll be very difficult to get a recovery in a short space of time. What I worry about above all is the loss of human capital, the migration of our best people. And once you have that, it's very difficult to recover. It's one thing if you destroy physical capital, it's another thing when you lose your human capital. The ability to recover from that becomes highly problematic.
It's infuriating, Nasser. I think it just comes down to political will, in the hands of a few.
Yes.
Alia, I want you to jump in here as well. I know you've got thoughts, and then we'll go to Marwan as well. So Alia, give me your sense of how you're looking at the Lebanon situation right now. I guess there's a glimmer of hope. At least that's what we're all optimistic about at this juncture, but it might mean nothing.
No, absolutely. I think the way markets look at Lebanon is intrinsically that it is a political economy problem, where the amount of state capture that has led to the crisis in the first place, but also has prevented any solution from the crisis since October 2019, is actually very much now standing in the way of moving towards a path of recovery in the context of an IMF program, or through any new government that will come in place will have to face this very high level of state capture and deep interests. And therefore, I think without really anchoring any IMF program in the future within a very strong governance framework. What Dr. Saidi said, accountability, an independent judiciary, a conflict of interest law, that should underpin any proposed, basically, a solution to the fundamental political issue of distribution of losses within the financial sector. Unless the Lebanese see that, but also financial markets are convinced that this governance anchor is there, I think it will be extremely difficult not only to convince the Lebanese, but also, I think, to get to a reasonable, sustainable solution with bondholders from a financial market perspective. And unfortunately, we do not see from a market perspective that the current political setup in Lebanon is conducive to that outcome.
Yeah. That's a pity to hear that view. Marwan, I want you to jump in here. What is your prognosis?
I look at what's happening in Lebanon in the context of what I call a long transformation process that the Arab world is going through, Eleni. When the first wave of Arab uprising subsided in, let's say, 2013, 14, people said the Arab uprisings failed, only to find out that a new wave of Arab uprisings came about in 2019 with Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Sudan. And that's precisely because the problems that led to the Arab uprisings in the first place were not addressed. Today, what we see in Lebanon, in my view, is only the beginning of a long transformation process in which, as Nasser said, we've witnessed 13, 14 people who, against all odds, against the grip on power that traditional forces in Lebanon have been able to come to parliament. Are they going to affect change immediately? Absolutely not. I totally agree. And the short-term perspective for Lebanon remains highly pessimistic in my view. But is this a process, potentially a process, where civil society is starting to emerge in the Arab world and where people are saying enough is enough? I think so. After all, the common thread that we have not explicitly, named in our discussion today is the lack of governance in the Arab world, political and economic. This is at the heart of most of the Arab world's problems. And, people here are saying enough is enough. We need good governance. I think this is a good start. I am cautiously optimistic, not because I think the problems of Lebanon are going to be solved overnight, but because I think this is an indication that people in the Arab world are no longer willing to accept their fate as they did before.
Thank you, Marwan. Jihad, you get all the tough questions about what the IMF is going to be doing in Lebanon and whether you're going to be, assisting. And of course, we know that you have, handed many ideas over in terms of transformation, what that would look like. Some of the questions that we're getting in: what do you think of the new parliament? Do you believe that they can do all the reforms demanded? There's concern that the IMF will not enter into an agreement with the government. Could you give us a sense of what you're doing right now and what conversations are being had? Because I tell you, there are a lot of rumors about whether the IMF is ready to jump in.
Well, thank you, Eleni. The nature, the depth, and the complexity of the crisis in Lebanon requires a comprehensive reform package, but also requires that solidarity with Lebanon is provided. And this is the sense of the IMF involvement in Lebanon. As you know, in April 7, we have reached a staff-level agreement that has outlined the key pillars of what is needed to address over time, because it requires more than one round of reforms, the challenges that Lebanon is facing. This reform program is based on what the authorities have designed, and it has to be a program that addresses the deep-rooted issues, but also provides social protection to those who need it with the deterioration of the social situation, and modernize and reform the state in order to strengthen governance and bring trust back. The staff-level agreement has a certain number of important reforms and immediate reforms to be implemented. And based on the implementation of those reforms, I would say Lebanon can gradually progress. This will help us reach the board approval of the program. And this is hopefully also will allow Lebanon to mobilize additional assistance from the international community, as well as also from the Friends of Lebanon. And last but not the least, and I would say the most important, this will help improve the trust of the Lebanese people in their future and allow them to, which they did in the past, build and invest and grow and create. I think those are the priorities that the Lebanese people are aspiring to. We look forward to work with the new government when the government is formed, with the parliament in order to accelerate this set of reforms.
Thank you so much, Jihad. Marwan, I want you to jump in here on the question on Egypt, we've got quite a few questions coming through. What is still ringing in my ear from what you said earlier is the possibility of a potential uprising as inequality levels increase, as inflation hits many vulnerable countries. What is your outlook on Egypt right now? Here's a question from Yasmin Munir from the Hubby newspaper. Egypt was mentioned as more than once as one of the countries facing great challenges at this stage. What are the developments of the new financing agreement between Egypt and the IMF? I know you can't speak to that directly, but what are your thoughts? And what is your sense on the exchange rate? We know they've taken a really big hit in terms of currency devaluation. What are you thinking on Egypt right now, Marwan?
Eleni, of course, I have to say that I'm not an economist, so I'm not in a position to answer these questions in details. I'll leave that to the economists in this discussion. What I do know is that the congruence of a closed political space and bad economic conditions is not a healthy formula for moving ahead. Yeah. And that is what we are facing in Egypt today. It's the congruence of a closed political space as well as bad economic conditions. Egypt is one of the largest importers of wheat from the Ukraine and Russia. They have been severely affected. Food prices have already gone up tremendously, as well as oil prices. They have been somewhat offset by huge aid from the Saudis to the tune of more than $5 billion, if not more now, as I've said before. But the ability of Gulf states to keep aiding Egypt, particularly if the Ukraine crisis lingers longer, and indications are that it will, then I think this is not a good formula. The exchange rate has dropped significantly in the last few months. I don't want to give a scenario of gloom and doom, but I don't think Egypt is in a good place today.
Alia, I know you want to jump in here as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to give a market perspective, I mean, obviously Egypt epitomizes the challenges that oil importing countries are facing. Although Egypt is really not affected as much as a net oil importer, it has a relatively balanced energy deficit, but still it's hit by imported inflation and at the same time the wheat crisis. But I think today, given the levels of debt, I think what is important for markets which have seen a significant widening in spreads related to Egypt and have basically worsened the debt dynamics in Egypt, it's extremely important to have a credible, a return to credible fiscal path of fiscal consolidation, and at the same time anchor it in a credible, flexible exchange rate framework. I think today, as we look at an external shock that is not a temporary one, but rather a prolonged shock, it is no one in the markets is convinced that Egypt can meet its external funding needs by insisting yet on doing another step devaluation. I think it will be ill-advised for monetary policy and monetary and exchange rate framework to continue as it was before. We do not think in the markets that would actually facilitate an IMF program, but also we do not think that will bring back portfolio flows to Egypt like what is expected to close a financing gap that is north of $20 billion for the next 12 months. So it is essential moving forward, not only to accelerate structural reform to bring back growth, continue fiscal consolidation, because fiscal policy and fiscal reforms have been going in the right direction over the past few years, but really make the important step change in adopting a flexible exchange rate framework.
Yeah, very interesting.
Just Eleni, on this one, if I can. I mean, let's remember that Egypt was following quite nicely an IMF reform program and was gradually implementing it until you got these external shocks. Now, the important thing is to stay the course. And I think structural reform in particular insofar as the role of state-owned enterprises is extremely important. When Marwan, and I can't remember who else was saying, the labor market and labor market reforms and job creation, as Jihad was saying, are the critical things that we need. When you have a dominant state-owned enterprise sector, in Morocco, it's more than 100% of GDP, yeah, controlled by state-owned enterprises. A lower level, but still very strong in Egypt. What you need to do is to create more space for the private sector. And therefore, reducing the size of the public sector, in particular state-owned and government-related enterprises, whether it's through privatization or other programs, is extremely important if you really want to get recovery going and you want to create the jobs in the dynamic sectors, not in the old sectors of the economy.
I mean, Nasser, would you suggest that even at this point in time to sell assets now?
No. Obviously, they'll be cheap.
Yeah.
But remember that this is a process. There's a process whereby you improve governance first, and then you consider privatization. But you need to create the space.
Absolutely. I feel like I need to go to Jihad on this, because this is a very IMF question related, right, issue, because Egypt has done really well. They've been able to create some of those structural reforms. We've just heard some of the warnings from Alia. Here's a question from Abu Omar from Bloomberg. When is the IMF expected to reach a deal with Egypt? Is there anything else you can give us in terms of information, what the IMF is doing with Egypt right now?
Well, 2 points before answering directly Abir's question. One, reform is a journey. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. And over the last 5 years, Egypt has been able to implement important reforms, not only in stabilizing their fiscal, reducing the level of inflation, but I would say also widening the social protection framework, with certain successes in terms of developing a targeted approach for social protection. They have been able to achieve high level of growth, 5 to 5.5%, despite COVID crisis that affected most countries in the region. But again, I think what is needed is to move from one level to a higher level of economic transformation. Where the challenges are today is, of course, Egypt was affected by the external shocks, not only the price of commodity, but also what we are seeing for other emerging markets, the changes in the trends in capital flows, the normalization of monetary policy, and the tightening, both in terms of availability of capital and interest rate, had affected several emerging markets. What are the issues or the priorities going forward? Is A, to be as data dependent in terms of monetary policy as ever. It's very important to keep an eye on keeping inflation under control. Have, as the colleagues mentioned, have a flexible exchange rate regime that provides a buffer to external shocks. Accelerate the economic transformation by allowing the private sector to grow, not only in terms of size, but also in terms of depth, by allowing startups, SMEs, all kinds of private operations to create jobs, not only large projects. And this is where the role of the state has to become more on an enabling side. The fund and Egypt have been working together since 2016 through 2 successful programs. One helped in the big transformation. The second one helped in protecting Egypt during COVID crisis. We are currently in a technical discussion in order to go over what are the priorities going forward in terms of stabilizing the situation, reducing the vulnerabilities to external shocks, and maintain, I would say, a drive that has allowed Egypt to grow at rates exceeding 5%. This would require to modernize also the role of the state. It requires to reform SOEs. It requires also to improve the capacity of the Egyptian economy to be on the export side and to have a current account that generates surpluses on continuous basis.
Thank you, Jihad. Arif, I want you to jump in here. There's a few questions that have actually come through for food security. Could you give me an idea of the Egyptian scenario right now that's playing out, if you have any? And then a few other questions that came through on the food security scenarios that are playing out specifically in the Gulf countries, if we start to see a global food crisis playing out. And there was another really interesting question that came through that, again, if we're talking about a prolonged crisis that emerges in Ukraine and Russia, what does that then mean for farmers to recalibrate, for fertilizer production to still come back into force? Do we have any idea of whether other countries can fill in those gaps?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, let me start by saying that, you know, when World Food Program is setting up records, that's not a good thing for the world. And in 2021, we assisted about 128 million people. This year, we are planning to assist about 147 million people with a budget of about $21.5 billion. So this is big money. Now, coming to the issue of why is this the case, right? So you have the usual suspects, okay, conflict, climate, COVID, rising costs. But then you have what you were saying. I mean, you have three things which are going up. One is obviously food prices, fuel prices, and your fertilizer prices. So right now, what we are seeing, in fact, is what I call the affordability crisis. There is enough food in the world. It's just that it's too expensive in different parts of the world, including Egypt, including West Africa, wherever, everywhere, basically. But if, for one reason or the other, we are not able to provide fertilizer, let's say to Africa, we are not able to provide pesticides and insecticides like agricultural inputs to the rest of the world, including in Russia, what you're going to see is a production crisis, an availability crisis. And that will really be terrible for the world. Now, the worst part here
is that your prognosis, though? Is that what you're anticipating, a production crisis?
Well, this is the thing, right? So planting is time sensitive, right? Yeah. So it's not like you can plant today and food will be there tomorrow, right? So, and there is a time when you plant. So if we are missing the planting seasons, whether it is for corn or for spring crops now, we're going to pay a price, because you cannot substitute just like this, right? And I think one thing which hasn't come up in this discussion is that this is not the first time we are in a food and fuel crisis. We were there in 2008. We were there in 2011. We even experienced during the COVID. And guess what? Most of the recommendations are essentially the same. The problem is that when the crisis goes away, we go back to sleep. And we don't address the structural problems. For me, the biggest structural problem on the agricultural side is that our exports are extremely concentrated in very few countries, very thin markets, and our stocks are even further concentrated. So when something happens to one of these countries, we feel it all around the world. Now, I'm not a proponent by any means of self-sufficiency, but more diversification, yes. That's something which to me is critically important. I mean, frankly, if you look at yourselves, I mean, you would not, in your investment portfolio, you would not have just one category of asset or just one asset. You would be diversified. Why is it that our agriculture, our food exports are not diversified or not sufficiently diversified? And if we can sort that problem out in the medium term, that would go a long way. Last thing I wanted to say is, like I think Jihad was saying this, you can break this problem or the timing in two. One, right now. What do we need right now? First, we need to help people. People who, if we don't help, die. And this is not exaggerating. That's the way it is outside in many countries. Second, we need the food to be affordable. How are you going to make it affordable in the near term? That's why flow of trade flow at affordable cost out of these places is critically important. Third, we need to stay away from these export bans, import subsidies, things like that, which we know maybe score political points, but they don't work. Now if we can do some of these things, we ease the pain a little bit. Now, I've been talking about all not so great things. What is good out there right now? Is something happening which is good? And for me, we have widespread consensus on the problem statement. Everybody agrees that this is a big problem. Can we get to a point where we have a consensus on the solution? That needs to be worked out still. Here, you are seeing IMF, World Bank, WTO, and World Food Program coming up at the highest level with joint statements in terms of what needs to happen. Frankly, I've never seen that before. And now, one very last thing I wanted to say was, look, talk is cheap, money matters. What we are seeing is US, President Biden just signed the bill for $40 billion, of which $5 billion is for food security. Germany is doing something similar. UK is doing something similar. Wouldn't it be great if we see something like that from our region, from this region, where there is a joint statement from some of the richest countries basically saying, this is what we are going to do for the world, but also starting charity at home, we are going to take care of problems of hunger in our part of the world, which will not only sort that out, and it would be a big political statement, but it will also ease pressure from the rest of the world. Sorry for talking too long, but I think it's
no, Arif. No, I'm glad. I'm so glad, because we need to be realistic about what's going on, because you're dealing with the immediacy of someone needing a meal now, today, or face, starvation, basically. And we're talking about children dying. And this must not be taken lightly. And what infuriates me, I see so many billions of dollars being put towards weaponry, and I understand why that happens, but there is money at hand for food. Did you ever get that money from Elon Musk, by the way?
No.
Safe space.
No.
But Eleni,
Right.
I mean,
it went into some escrow, but it never made it to us.
It never came to you. All right, we have to tweet him again.
Arif is absolutely right to point to this need for trade liberalization. You don't have embargoes, you don't have quotas, you don't want all that. And I'm entirely for it. The G7 got together and they said they're going to have a global alliance for food security. Hey, hooray, I'm very pleased with that. But I have a word of warning. We've seen this happen already with the vaccines. Remember the vaccines, Arif?
Yes.
Yes.
Everybody was saying, hey, look at Africa, only 2% vaccination rate. We've got to help these people. And what did we see happen? The US, the UK, the Europeans, etc. All of them sat on the vaccines, and Elena, people were dying all over, and they did nothing about it. So I don't want to be pessimistic, but again, I think we need to be very realistic. I think the message that greater regional cooperation is certainly there, and that I repeat my call. I think this is where the fund with, for example, the AMF, Arab Monetary Fund, and others should put together a financing facility for food and energy for the vulnerable countries of the region, because what you want to avoid is civil unrest. I mean, let's recall how the Arab Spring started, and it started in Tunisia, Egypt, and the rest. And a lot of it had to do with unemployment, but also very high food prices. We're maybe
and
not
there's actually a question
level,
that's come through. Actually, while you're talking, you just mentioned Tunisia. Are we heading towards a Lebanese scenario in Tunisia, where do the IMF negotiations with the government stand? Okay, this is okay. Sorry, I just saw the word Tunisia and Lebanon. And Nasser, what do you think?
No, I think the macroeconomic situation in Tunisia is vastly different than what it is in Lebanon. The multiple crises that we have in Lebanon are not comparable. True, they're facing a number of issues on financing, but I think Tunisia is a different set of issues than what we have in Lebanon.
Okay, we don't have much time left, and I have to agree with you, by the way, Nasser. We have a lot
if
of
I may,
flash.
can I just add one small
Yeah.
thing to Tunisia that is important, because this is
Yes.
now one of the most distressed credits in emerging markets. And I do have to say that Tunisia both have done its homework as a government in terms of putting forward a clear path towards essential reforms, both on the fiscal, on the structural, and trying to continue mobilize external funding in a credible manner. The problem, obviously, is the political context that is preventing a move towards that. But I think, if I may have a call onto the Tunisian government, is really to communicate better with markets, and also make available their government programs so that there is more dialogue and discussions about the elements of this reform program. Because the more transparent it is, the easier it is for building consensus around it.
Jihad, do you want to quickly touch on this before we go for wrap comments?
Well, we have already, mentioned that the fund and Tunisia are currently in discussions. There is progress. The reform program that has been put forward is promising. The managing director met with the Prime Minister yesterday in Davos, and we are progressing in the discussions on the bilateral side.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I have to agree with Nasser. I mean, we have so many plush sovereign wealth funds in this region. We have oil exporting countries. The region should be doing more for itself, for its people. And I really want to reiterate that point. And it's a question, to be honest, that I'll be posing to all the policymakers that I'll be interviewing going forward. We're going to start wrapping up. And Marwan, I want to start with you. If you could give me a sense of what you're thinking, walking away, firstly, from this conversation, but secondly, what you think policymakers should be doing right this minute to deal with these risks that we hadn't anticipated.
Lenny, the way I approach these problems is I understand the immediacy of the problem. I understand the need to act now because people are dying, because people have severe problems. But we cannot just focus on the immediate unless we do something serious structurally about reforms in this region, economic and political. Unless we really start to address these seriously, we're going to face the same problem next year and the year after of how to do ad hoc reforms that address the here and now, but ignore the long-term stability and prosperity of the region. So if there is a message from me today, it is this: the need for structural reforms has been yesterday, but we cannot ignore them just because we have an immediate solution, problem to solve. Ignoring them is going to be at the risk of the long-term stability and prosperity of the region.
Thank you. Nasser.
I think we've discussed that there are big divergences in terms of the outcomes for this year and maybe the next across the region. Big differences in the terms of trade shock and how much you're importing from the rest of the world in terms of shocks coming to you. And we've said there's an energy shock, a food price shock, but there's also a financing, a debt shock for many of the countries of the region. And overlooking all that is the potential that the world outlook may not be positive, that we may be heading towards recession fairly quickly over the next 12 months. So we understand that. The question is, what should we be doing at the level of the region? And I think there are two issues. One is, I think I'd like to see much more attention being given to social protection. Yeah. When we talk about food poverty and hunger, and we look at the level of inequality and poverty, I'm struck by what's happening in the region. And yet our social protection programs are not up there. Very few places have unemployment insurance. What do you do about retirement? What do you do about all those issues having to do with social protection? So I think that's one. Second, I think Jihad was pointing, and it passed quickly. He was talking about data and statistics. That is critical. What strikes me in many countries of the region is that we don't have what we call evidence-based policy making. I'd like to see much more evidence-based policy making, because once you have evidence-based policy making then you have some accountability, because then you can point out, why did you do this program? What was it based on? And can I see the outcomes? And then hold you responsible for that. And the final one was, I fully concur with Marwan. The issue of structural reforms is always brought up, then we put it on the back burner because there's some urgent other issue that comes up now. I think we cannot do that. And I think part of the responsibility, both of ourselves as economists, but also of the international institutions, IMF, World Bank, UN, WFP, and others, is to keep reminding the governments of the region of the importance of structural reforms because of the demographic time bomb we're all sitting on. Job creation is the critical question for the countries of our region. And we need to create those. And we need to create those in the private sector. And climate change, which we have not discussed, is on our doorstep. It is here. You look at the sandstorms and the heat storms we're having across the Gulf. Those are not going to go away. They're going to become worse. We lack the water, we lack food security, etc. So we need to address all of those issues. So structural change is what it has to be about. But we have to sit around and deal with them, not on an individual country basis. These are regional type issues. So I think regional cooperation, trade liberalization, trade agreements, opening up countries to the movement of labor are important issues. So let's keep hammering on those.
Thank you, Nasser. Really interesting to hear from your perspective. And just, you know, I'm glad you mentioned climate change, because I think that's one sector that we tend to ignore when we're dealing with another financial crisis. Alia, I want you to jump in here. And actually, there's a question which I wanted to ask, but didn't get to ask, but a viewer reminded me on this. Shouldn't we just increase oil and gas production to help reduce oil prices, right? So you drive out speculation in the market, because we know the speculative number is about $20 to $30 a barrel. But then I'm going to refer to something someone else said earlier, is that we don't really know what the demand scenario is going to look like as you see shutdowns in China, as you see economic growth coming under pressure. Alia, you seem to be the big sort of, you know, markets focused person here. What is your view on this?
I mean, obviously there are both fundamental and geopolitical drivers for oil markets at present, and I think given the uncertainty on the demand side and also the uncertainty on the supply in terms of the need to keep OPEC act in a consolidated manner at a time where geopolitical tension is rising, is what is going to keep a volatility in the oil price ahead of us. And I think when it comes to our region, this is puts more the onus on really having robust fiscal frameworks that are able, on the one hand, that are able to deal with such a volatility. And as we discussed, particularly for many of the oil importers with large external funding needs, to embrace a more flexible exchange rate framework in order to address, to act as a shock absorber in a context where
so is that a yes or a no?
Competition for resources is very high, and I think this is where we need to make to really emphasize the need really to adopt these structural reforms that would allow many of those that are shut out of the market to come back with a more credible narrative on both structural reform, credible fiscal consolidation, and flexible exchange rates.
The answer, Eleni, is yes. You need to increase production. Yeah,
there you go. All right, thank you. I just thank you, Nasser. Okay, Arif, are you also going to say yes? I'm sure, but also just closing comments before we go to Jihad.
Look, I mean, for me, I mean, it's about personalizing the problem.
Yes. You
know, we absolutely must personalize this problem. And maybe for me also, it is about asking one other question, which is, what is the cost of inaction? What if you don't do anything? Who will it cost, and what will it cost, and where? And guess what? If you really took that answer seriously, the political economy of that will tell you that we are way better off sorting these things out when they happen than letting it fester and then pay thousands times more, both economically and politically. So that's my message please take this seriously, because if we don't, we're going to pay a whole lot more, maybe a little bit later, but we're going to pay a whole lot more.
Thank you, Arif. Thank you very much. Jihad, I give the last word to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Alina. I very much learned during this discussion. I would say, where do we stand today? It's we're at the crossroad, at the transformative moment. We have been through crises like this in the past. I hope that we will learn from the past and not repeat it. This is, I think it's very important going forward. Not repeating the past is allowing us to have a better utilization of our resources, our natural resources, our financial resources, but more importantly, our human resources. I think this is where we need to have a huge shift in mentality and leadership by being more transparent to the people on what are the trade-offs and what are the challenges that countries are facing and where we should put our effort and our resources. And be more participatory in the decision-making. Having better utilization of advice and of what we have accumulated as knowledge over the past. This is not the first time that we address issues related to food security or to energy cycle, or even to external shocks. I think we have to accept that we are part of the world and we are faced with the challenges that the world is facing. We have two ways to do it. Or we take the course of reform that is painful, that takes time, but this is the right one, that over time will help us strengthen our economies, build for a better future, embrace and be able to embrace the transformative trends of the moment, climate. I think Nasser mentioned it, you mentioned it also, Eleni. Technology and how technology can bring in terms of big transformation, allow the region that has a wealth of history, talent, and knowledge, and geographically is located at a very strategic position, is to benefit from that. There are challenges, of course, but always when you have those big transformative moments, this is when you can, if you play your cards well, you can succeed. For us at the fund, we see ourselves as the partner of the region, and we have been raising some of those important issues, reforming state-owned entities, reforming the state, increasing transparency, improving social protection by changing the way policies are done. We will have a paper coming on informality and where to address the root cause of informality, how to use tax policies to create more, not only better public finance, but also better equity. We are about to issue a book on inclusion and how the COVID crisis has affected inclusion in the region. Those are important issues that we need to work on with the region. I hear very much what also Marwan, Alia, Arif, and Nasser said on regional. The region can play a role. And we are, as a partner with the region, ready to help in that. Not only address food security issue, but also address climate transformation priorities, and I think more importantly, bring a better future to the young generation of the region and allow women to play a bigger role in leading the journey going forward. A lot
Thank
to
you
say,
so much,
but the time is
No, it's lovely. And I just want to quickly say, I'm new to the region. I come from South Africa. I've been covering Africa for such a long time. And I have to say, I feel like there's a dual speed, scenario playing out in various countries where I'm in Dubai, I'm in the UAE. I've never been so plugged into technology before. I see the incredible efforts and productivity and efficiencies, and it's exciting. And then I see the biggest crises playing out in some of our neighbors. And I think, how do we alleviate that pressure? We can, here in this region, work closer together to be able to, the riches and the wealth, and I'm not talking about it monetary wise, but the abundance that is evident here in the region can be spread through expertise and skills and assistance in some way. And Jihad, I'm going to read, you were saying we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. We've seen these crises before, but I think in 2022, we should not be talking about acute hunger anymore. It might sound egalitarian, but thank you to the IMF and to you, Jihad, for people leading your departments, thinking about these themes deeply, and for making changes on the ground in the countries that need it most. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure, and I look forward to engaging with you on the air, asking the tough questions, and you being as open as you have been with me today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.